Okay, well, good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to the latest in our webinar series. As members of the DLM Forum are well aware, the amount of data generated by public bodies, businesses, and citizens is growing ever more quickly. Indeed, some estimates suggest that during the period 2018 to 2025, it will increase fivefold. While this represents a continuing challenge, it also provides opportunities. And in order to better exploit the potential of ever-growing data within a trustworthy European framework, the Commission has put forward a proposal for a European Data Governance Act. This was adopted by the Council on the 25th of November 2020, and negotiations are currently ongoing in the Council and in the European Parliament. These new rules are intended to allow data to be harnessed and to pave the way for sectoral European data spaces to benefit society, citizens, and companies. The Commission has proposed 9 such data spaces, ranging from industry to energy and from health to the European Green Deal. They will, for example, contribute to the green transition by improving the management of energy consumption, make delivery of personalised medicines a reality, and facilitate access to public services. More dedicated proposals and data spaces are expected to follow in 2021, complemented by a Data Act to foster data sharing among businesses and between businesses and governments. The Data Governance Act puts in place enabling structures and mechanisms that will serve as the foundation for future work on data, including on the sectoral data spaces. Today's webinar will focus on the different elements proposed under the Data Governance Act, how they'll work in practice, and how they'll contribute to achieving the objectives of the proposal. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Andrea Katalin-Toth, who will lead today's webinar. Andrea is Legal and Policy Officer at the Directorate General for Communications Networks, Content and Technology of the European Commission. And I'm aware that I've already delayed matters quite long enough, so without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over proceedings to Andrea.
Thank you very much, David, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for this opportunity for me to be here today with you and to present the Data Governance Act and this really important and, well, I would say it's a milestone of a legal initiative. I might be biased because as a legal and policy officer in the Data Policy and Innovation Unit within DigiConnect, I've been part of the drafting team and I'm also taking part in the negotiations of this proposal. But hopefully through my presentation, I would be able to convey this importance and the gravity to you as well. So without further ado, I would like to start. But before just really jumping into the details and the different parts of the Data Governance Act, I would like to put it into a sort of a wider context and give some introduction on the relevance of data and maybe shed some light on why this proposal is so important. So this may help you understand the basic ideas and logic behind the objectives of this rather technical piece of legislation. So I hope you can hear me and see me well, but most importantly, I hope you can see the presentation as well. Okay, so first of all, I would like to draw your attention to the State of Union speech of President von der Leyen from last year, where she emphasized the urgency and the necessity to act when it comes to data to be able to secure a leading position for the EU in this field. So you might have heard about the second wave of industrial data, referring mainly to the innovation and the volume of innovation that is expected to take place based on this type of data, and that the EU really needs to sort of ride this wave to be in the lead position on data and the data economy. Also, the data was identified as a focus point in the Commission's agenda, and the common sectoral European data spaces received a special mention, a sort of a key in the support for innovation ecosystems where the collection and the access to and collaboration on the data could happen. But what are exactly these data spaces. So this might be a term that you might have heard being thrown around lately quite a lot without any sort of complete explanation. So first of all, the Common European Data Space is really a concept. So it is not a concrete overarching platform, but it is an arrangement, which is on one hand composed of an ICT environment for the secure processing of data by an open and unlimited number of organizations, people. And on the other hand, it is a set of rules of legislative, administrative, and contractual nature that really determine the rights of access to and processing of data, of course, always in compliance with already existing union legislation, such as the GDPR or competition law. So a data space is really a combination of the hard infrastructure, the IT environment, through which the actual data activities take place, and the soft infrastructure, meaning the governance rules that regulate these data activities. So these data spaces can be established and governed in a variety of different ways. It can be done by the public sector, for example, in the field of health or environment or public administration. It can be also done by the private sector. If we take examples, for example, of agriculture and manufacturing. Or as a third option, they can also be established and governed in a sort of mixed situation, for example, by way of public-private partnerships. And it is also important to note that there will be data pools, of course, within the data spaces, where the free flow of data will be ensured. And it's very important to underline that all data access and use will not necessarily be always for free. So we often have come across the misconception from the part of different stakeholders saying that they are hesitant to support these objectives and the establishment of data spaces because they fear that participating in a data space would mean obligatory data sharing with everyone without any sort of remuneration. So this is absolutely not the case, where data access and sharing is based on contractual arrangements, for example. Then, of course, it is up to the parties to that agreement to decide whether or not they share data for free in return of some form of remuneration, or they are the ones that really determine the details of their cooperation. So letting data into the data spaces does not mean that all data will be also open and just free to use for everyone. Of course, where relevant and mandated or accommodated by legislation on open data, for example, public sector data could also be part of the pool, but data would also come from, for example, personal data spaces or the private sector as well, in the form of industrial data. So in short, any sort of arrangement and constellation around data could be found in a data space. And what is determined by the soft infrastructure is really the governance rules of how this could take place. So on this slide, this scheme is broadly sketched out, also mentioning the different sectoral data spaces that David also mentioned in his introduction. So another very important thing to note is that the data governance itself does not set up any of the data spaces. It is a horizontal legislation, so it only provides a toolbox of this horizontal framework for data sharing, which could be used also, of course, within or for the sectoral data spaces. So the data spaces will be set up by, for example, other legislation, like the European Health Data Space Initiative, which is going to be a Commission proposal coming out, if I'm not mistaken, still this year. But it can also be done by other means, as mentioned. So the achievements of the data governance proposal are going to be essential in the proper functioning of the data spaces and the data economy in general. But of course, with a horizontal legislation, it is sort of a mission impossible to cater for the specificities of every single sector and of the different fields. So we try to find really the commonalities and the common rules and the common mechanisms that could be of benefit of all these sectors later on. But after all this talk about the data spaces, I think it is also worth revisiting some of the economic aspects of data to emphasize really what is at stake here. So it is expected that the volume of data that is produced annually in the world will grow from the 33 zettabytes in 2018 to 175 zettabytes in 2025. And in terms of economy, this means that the data economy, which is estimated to be worth over 324 billion euros at the end of 2019, representing 2.6% of the GDP of the EU 27. So there is, of course, a slowdown which is expected because of the COVID crisis, but it is also anticipated that it will be followed by a rebound. But still, it is quite a substantial number and quite a substantial amount and a ratio of the gross domestic product. Other than that, data is also the basis for new digital products and services. So it is essential for example, the training of AI systems. And an example is a self-driving car. So in addition to the data that is generated by the car itself, for it to be able to function properly, you need third-party data from all over to operate securely, irrespective of weather conditions, visibility, road surface, and so on. Additionally, the use of data also drives productivity and resource efficiency gains all across the sectors of the economy. And what's also probably very important that it is a critical resource for startups and SMEs, in particular, as a business can be set up with very low initial capital if your profile is around data. So there's been a study that found that over 99% of the data supplier companies and over 98% of data user companies in the EU are SMEs. And some of 80%, 85% of the new jobs created in the data economy come from the SMEs based from data on data from last year. So based on all this information that I just thrown at you carelessly, it seems justified to really step up and help the development of the data economy with the best means possible. Thankfully, when it comes to the legislative framework around the data economy, we don't have to build it from scratch, because in the recent years, there has been a significant amount of work done to provide, for example, for guidelines. Here I'm thinking about the practices and pledges made by the high-level expert group on business to government data sharing. There are best practices. And of course, there is both sectoral and horizontal legislation regarding data. In horizontal, such as the GDPR, the e-privacy directive, the revised PSI, now Open Data Directive, or the Free Flow of Data Regulation. And of course, we have sectoral legislation on, for example, smart metering, intelligent transport systems, among others. And all these provide a really solid ground for the further development of the data economy. And now we really arrive to the topic of the data strategy, which came out February last year. And I think it's very important to see really the big picture, because this document sets out the plan for the Commission for the realization of all these objectives around data. And it is really our ground document for the policy work in this field. So the main goal of the data strategy is to create the single market for data, a sort of encompassing common European data space, with the smaller sectoral ones, of course, operating within. So just very shortly, this document sets out the way the Commission envisages to operationalize its work. And it is based on 4 pillars, which are really at the heart of the data strategy. So the first one is a cross-sectoral governance framework for data access and use. And this includes, of course, a governance framework for the data spaces, as well as other cross-sectoral measures, such as, for example, prioritization of standards to enhance cross-sector interoperability. The second pillar is the investments that are envisaged to be put into the development of the data market through different projects, for example, such as the high-impact project on the European data spaces, federated cloud infrastructures. So in this sense, the Commission is also providing the financial means for the realization of these policy objectives. The third pillar is the development of the competences and investing in digital skills and data literacy in order to have, of course, more people who could deploy these latest technologies. And while the fourth one concerns the rollout of the European sectoral data spaces within the different crucial sectors that David also mentioned, such as health, manufacturing, mobility, finance, and the others. There's basically a list of 10 such data spaces. But this is just the sectors that are important from the EU's perspective and will be facilitated by the Commission through funding programs. It doesn't mean that other data spaces, for example, in other sectors or across sectors, cannot be established. So the option to set up voluntary data spaces will, of course, still remain. But let's go back very quickly to the first pillar of this strategy, the establishment of a cross-sector governance framework. So the Commission received a mandate to implement some key actions in the form of proposing legislative initiatives. And the first initiative is the Data Governance Act. And we're going to discuss, of course, in depth the details of the proposal. Indeed, it came out on the 25th of November last year. And indeed, it is only just a Commission proposal, which means that negotiations are ongoing both in the Council and in the European Parliament. And if you just allow me for a quick second, I need to acknowledge both the incredible work of the Portuguese presidency in the Council, as well as the whole team in the European Parliament, including the lead ITRE committee and the rapporteurs office, Ms. Angelika Niebler and her team, as well as all the shadow rapporteurs and the associated committees in the EP, because there's been really a good cooperation and they've been taking up this file with a great ambition and has been made a significant contribution and advance on the progress of this file. But going back to all the other initiatives that are already out or are still envisaged, we have the Digital Market Act, which was also adopted at the end of last year. But this one really focuses specifically on the core platform services that are considered as gatekeepers and on their role in reinforcing market imbalances and distortions, and addresses the issues around access and portability. So we have the Implementing Act on the high-value data sets, for which the mandate can be found in the Open Data Directive. This one is still expected to come out this year, and it will contain rules on the harmonized provision of public sector data that have a specifically high value, such as maps or weather information and statistics, business registries. And these data will have to be made available for free in machine readable format and through APIs. And finally, the Data Act is envisaged to address a number of issues around and different aspects of rights over data under the organizing principle of fairness. So it will aim to clarify unclear situations around the interest in data, namely the usage rights of code-generated IoT data. It will also look at business to government data sharing situations, and it will also contain the review of certain part of the IPR regime, most notably the Database Directive. So just to make a clear delineation, while the Data Governance Act regulates the framework for data sharing through structures and mechanisms to increase trust, the Data Act will touch on the substance and the substantive rights around data, and we will focus on what is fair in relation to this data access and use so that the total value of data can be maximized. The Data Act is still foreseen to come out this year. But now really getting to the main topic of today, the Data Governance Act. So when it comes to this first tangible results under the data strategy, the basic idea behind this proposal was to really help and create a new alternative to the business models that currently we see around data, and to offer a new approach, a sort of European approach, which would put the data holders, whether they be individuals or companies, back in the center when it comes to the use of the data, while also addressing certain issues that currently hinder the development of the EU's data market. So we've seen that there are issues such as the high transaction cost of data transactions, the insufficient availability of data for reuse, and of course, there has been some emerging regulatory fragmentation among member states, because some of them have already started to act a little faster or a little earlier than the others on data technologies and digitalization. So the objective of the proposal is really to foster trust in voluntary data sharing, because if you don't have trust, you will not be able to address these issues. There will be no more sharing. There will be no lowering of the transaction cost. There will be no more data available for app for use. So it's really important to target the trust in voluntary data sharing by putting in place certain enabling structures and mechanisms that would increase this trust and facilitate data sharing. So again, this proposed framework is an overarching one. It's a horizontal framework. And this is to be seen as a foundation based on which the individual sectoral data spaces will be built. So this foundation of the Data Governance Act proposal is made up of 3 substantive pillars and 1 encompassing one, which is relevant for all the other pillars. And I would like to just really go into the details of that right now. So the first one of the big pillars is, you can find it in chapter 2 of the proposal. And it is maybe the one that might be of interest to you the most, because the objective here is to facilitate the reuse of certain publicly held, certain public sector data that would normally be not accessible as open data because they are protected by certain third-party rights. So I think it's important to clarify what reuse is, although I might be preaching to the choir here. But when we talk about reuse, it's basically the use of this public data for a purpose that is different from the one for which it was originally collected and used by the public sector bodies in the course of performing their public tasks. So one example that I could give you is health data. Your health data is collected, for example, by your GP or your hospitals to give you and provide you treatment. But all this information can be very valuable also to be used for research. So this would be something of a reuse situation when research institutes or universities would be able to get access to such data. Of course, I will go into detail just in a second under what conditions. But again, the idea here was to provide for a number of conditions along which the safe and secure reuse of such data that are sensitive because of all these protections could be allowed. In order to move on really from this dichotomy of open and closed data, and to be able to exploit the potential of these public data sets through the use of privacy enhancing or privacy preserving technologies. So think about data sets that are protected by third-party rights because, for example, they are personal data. They contain commercially confidential information that are protected by trade secrets. Or of course, we have the huge array of different intellectual property rights that third parties could have over such, well, I wouldn't say data because of course there's no IPR over the data itself, but over the data sets that incorporate the data. So the inspiration here on one hand came from national solutions, such as FinData or the French Health Data Hub, that centralize the procedure of reuse of certain sensitive public sector data. And on the other hand, from the practice of statistical offices that employ secure processing environments to make statistical microdata available for queries without actually seeing or accessing the raw data itself. So this part of the proposal is completely complementary to the Open Data Directive, and it covers data that is outside of the scope of that directive. So it is also very important to note that the proposal of the DGA, the Data Governance Act, does not create an access regime. So it is dependent completely on the member states' legislation. It will be up to the member states to decide which public data sets they want to open up and how. It also does not create a new legal basis for the processing of personal data. And here I would like to just quickly go back to FinData and share some details about it, because this is a very good example of how the reuse and the further processing of such sensitive data could be realized. So FinData is the Finnish data permit authority. It really does the authorization of reuse of health and social data. Of course, there are a number of conditions and a number of rules around its functioning. For example, it comes into picture when data is coming from different registers. There is a purpose limitation, so the reuse would have to be for research or educational or a number of other purposes. And it's also this permit authority is also using the secure processing environment solution that the Data Governance Act is trying to foster and further. By the way, it's similarly to what the French Data Hub is doing. And of course, there's always a possibility, for example, under the regime of the French Data Hub to also bring the algorithm to the data. So the whole, or the ground principle is really not to show the data, not to be able to see the actual data itself, but still be able to extract value and to be able to, example, run algorithms on these very important data sets. Because sometimes we come across the problem that AI solutions, algorithms cannot be trained on European data because there are, of course, different legislations and different hurdles in place. And these would have to go outside of the EU, which might not be beneficial and ideal for the actual end result of the development of such services and applications. So this would be one solution. This would be one way to go forward. And of course, this is in the case of FinData, it's a public authority. It's very new. It's been only in place since and functioning since taking requests since early 2020, but there have been already over 400 applications. And I would just wanted to show you that we are inspiring ourselves also from actually working and working solutions that are already in place in some instances. But with that, I would like to also just quickly maybe run through the organizational structure that is in the Data Governance Act proposal itself, because it might be something that causes confusion in the very technical legal text. So regarding the organizational structure, the main aim was to provide as much flexibility to member states as possible, by also ensuring harmonization. So the solution for that was through prescribing to have specific functions in place, which could be assigned to either already existing structures or newly set up bodies. So one such function would be the single information point, which would work as a one-stop shop really in each member state. And the aim would be to have at least one collection point where the reusers could go if they wanted access, not necessarily access, but if they wanted to be able to reuse sensitive publicly held data. So the single information point would then relay the request to the actual public sector body that holds the relevant data, or to a specific competent body, which either has a legal mandate to grant the reuse itself or functions as a sort of support mechanism for the public sector bodies where the data resides. So these public sector bodies, of course, could include public hospitals, where, for example, providing a secure processing environment would be very much difficult to set up. And these competent bodies would then step in and provide technical and legal support for these entities. So in that sense, again, if national legislation so provides, these competent bodies could have really a double function. On one hand, providing technical and legal support, and on the other hand, authorizing reuse themselves. So this was all I wanted to talk to you about under the first main pillar. But of course, I'll be very happy to take your questions after the presentation and to engage in a discussion if this is something of interest to you. But moving on now, I would like to move over to the second pillar, which is really about classical data sharing. And you can find it in chapter 3. And through these provisions here, we aim to set a number of rules around the operation of one specific kind of entities, data sharing intermediaries, in order to create trust and generate the bigger uptake for these novel intermediaries. And also really just to create a healthy and a competitive market in this emerging field. So we have different constellations in scope. We have business-to-business data intermediaries, which could function as data marketplaces, services that allow for the formation of joint data pools or ecosystem orchestrators. We also have consumer-to-business solutions, such as the personal data spaces or PIMS, the personal information management services. They build mainly on the GDPR's portability, right? And we also have data cooperatives that aim to facilitate the collective bargaining and decision-making about data. It's important to note what is not in the scope. These are situations where there's, for example, just one company sharing its data with the public or a number of users, or when it's just only about the provision of a software and not a service in itself. So really where there is no active intermediation carried out by the service provider. So the targeted intermediaries here are the pure intermediaries, the sort of matchmakers of the data economy, connecting supply and demand, while of course preserving the control of the data holder over the decisions on whom and under what conditions they share their data with. So like one of my colleagues like to refer to it, it's really, we're targeting the sort of Tinders for data. And important point is here the control. Again, just like I mentioned at the beginning, we want to put the holders of the data in the center position to be able to make decisions, and which is a sort of a contrast to the current prevalent models, business models adopted by the integrated technology services and tech companies. So we try to achieve these goals, part of the vision, by setting up a number of requirements according to which these intermediaries need to function. And the main one being to be neutral in the sense that they cannot use the data shared through them to provide value-added services. So this would be enforced through a separation requirement, meaning that if a company wants to offer this kind of services, the data intermediation, they will have to put them in a separate legal entity in order to prevent self-preferencing and the cross-use of data for purposes that we would like to prevent. And I would like to present to you two examples. One of them is a French company called Davex. So this would be an example for a business-to-business data sharing platform. And I hope that, okay, it's just a matter of seconds. So Davex offers a data exchange platform, which means that companies can come and sort of monetize on their data. For example, if you're a retail company, you have all this very important, very interesting data on customers, what sort of products they are buying, when are the peak hours, what are the peak hours in your store, what sort of items get bought together. And there could be very good and very useful insights based on this data for other companies, for other businesses, for example, in the agriculture sector, or for example, for different brands. So of course, we should, for example, companies like Davex enable is to be able to sort of trade in this industrial data. And here, of course, we are strictly talking about non-personal data when we are talking about also monetization. So it's really just a marketplace for the supply and demand to meet. And I just wanted to show you that, you know, of course, there's an interface for that. But here, just to be able to better exploit and use the intrinsic value that we have in data, and which is often just goes unused, and the full potential of it is not realized. And the other example that I brought to you is, actually, this is a UK company, so I should make this caveat that, of course, they are not part of the EU company ecosystem anymore. But I think DigiMe is a very good example of what a personal information management system is. So here, the idea is really to empower the citizens, the individual, around their data, and to give them decision of how their data is used. And I don't seem to, okay, hopefully now it works. So again, the way this service works is that you will be able to pool your data, your personal data, for example, that you generate and have over different services, for example, social media platforms, your Fitbit, your other smart devices, and you would be able to share that with specific apps that you choose under the conditions that you agree to. So for example, you could use it for different health purposes or health tracking apps. Again, you can also use it for tracking your social media use, for example. But the whole idea, and I think I cannot emphasize this enough, is to have the people in the place, in the driving seat about the decisions over their data. And here, of course, we're talking about personal data. And this comes, of course, on top of the GDPR and in compliance with it completely. So with that, I would like to also just quickly move on to the provisions around data altruism, which are our third and last substantive part. And so these provisions came into being to create more tools and opportunities for individuals and companies who are willing to share their data for altruistic purposes, for the common good, without any directly reward for them. We have seen the importance of altruistically sharing, for example, health data to fight off the pandemic. And here we devised a sort of voluntary registry of data altruism organizations, which would serve as a trust mark that shows that to the public that the entities that have this mark, they have this registration, function in a transparent and trustworthy manner. So this possibility to get registered will be open for nonprofit organizations that collect data for their own general interest purposes or pass it on to other entities. And of course, with the full informed consent of the data subject when this is about personal data. So this sort of framework would give these organizations visibility and trust, and for the people or companies who want to share data for the common good, and assurance that these entities really play by certain rules and provide transparency, for example, about where the data is going, what entities use them at the end. And also there would be a consent management facilitated through an EU level consent form. And here we're really talking about a very specific and special type of data sharing. And it covers instance when data is donated by either individuals or companies. And I put donated in these air quotation marks because it has the word has the connotation that if you donate something, you lose control over it. But of course, with data, this is not the case. So for data subjects, you would also always have the opportunity to withdraw your consent for the data processing. And also we'd like to provide similar mechanisms for companies when they provide their non-personal industrial data for altruistic purposes. So what sort of data are we talking about here? Again, health data for the rare diseases, but we had a very interesting use case in the Commission about aggregated and anonymized localization data, which was used by our Joint Research Center, again, to map the spreading of the virus and to be able to come up with good policy responses and measures to counter the pandemic. So during our research, we found that there is really a great interest and willingness to share data for the common good purposes. But on the one hand, there are not enough or not sufficient means or tools to do it. And on the other hand, there is also an issue of trust. So this is why we came up with this voluntary registration model. Just like, again, an example is, some of you might have come across it, the Corona-Datenspenden application, which is basically an application from the Robert Koch Institute in Germany. And the way it worked is that you could share your data from your Fitbit, such as your temperature, heart rate, and all these other information that it collects, with the Institute to be able to monitor the pandemic and be able to also to foresee the different little points where there might be an insurgence of new cases. And with that, I will conclude, I promise, very shortly, because we only have the overarching pillar left, which is about the European Data Innovation Board. This would be an expert group with member state experts and representatives of data spaces and the relevant sectors. And on one hand, it would facilitate the cooperation between the member states and assist in developing best practices regarding all the other areas that the proposal aims to tackle, such as reuse, the notification of intermediaries, and the registration of data tourism organizations. And on the other hand, it would facilitate the Commission's work in the process of requesting European standardization organizations to draft standards and to recommend appropriate standards and technical specifications for data exchange to use in the common European data spaces. Because interoperability and standardization in interoperability is very important. All these provisions and tools that we have in the proposal are very nice, but really they can only have a limited impact if there is limited interoperability. So it should be ensured that, data is not kept in silos, but there is a flow and communication also between sectors, because really cross-sector data sharing is something that is vastly underused. And with that, I would like to just draw your attention again to the fact that the Data Act is still coming out this year, and we have recently opened up open public consultation online, as well as a consultation on the Inception Impact Assessment for the Data Act. So I would also be very happy to hear about your views in the remaining time. Of course, apart from your questions, if you have any, that what do you feel how these proposed measures in the Data Governance Act, for example, address some of the issues that you have come across, or what is it that you're missing? What are the different areas or issues that we need to tackle, for example, as part of the Data Act? And with that, thank you very much for your patience and for your attention. And I'm, of course, here if there's any questions or concerns. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea, for a very engaging talk in a very complex area, which I think you handled tremendously well. While you've been presenting, I have received one question in the chat, which I'd like to pass on to you. It says that one core element of trust is trust in the availability and authenticity of data for as long as is necessary. And part of ensuring that such trust is the presence of efficient and interoperable rules for data archiving and long-term availability. Now, most international data governance frameworks place a lot of emphasis on such data lifecycle and archiving strategies, but there does not appear to be much attention given to this area within the EC directive. Well, that's the statement. Question now follows, is that statement correct? And if so, is there going to be any more specific act or directive in future to address such data governance issues? So.
Thank you very much. Thank you, David, and thank you for the question as well. Indeed, I think I can only agree that one part of the trust is actually the authenticity and also the quality of the high quality of the data, because that is really the basis. So if you have faulty goods, if you don't have the right ingredients, your dinner is not going to be as tasty as you would like it to be. And with interoperability, I think the most we thought that we could do was really by putting in place a governance mechanism in the form of the innovation board. So of course, we as an expert group, it cannot develop the standards itself, but there is a huge need to have input from the sectors and from the relevant stakeholders themselves on where to go with interoperability, where to go with standardization, what should be prioritized. So we thought that there should be a more of a sort of like governmental guidance, more of a public sector initiative in that, and not just leave it completely up to the private sector. But to the more specific point on archiving, indeed, so this proposal, that's true. You cannot really find anything that is very specific to the archiving and of course preserving data and all its features. Here, what we were trying to do is really concentrate on the sharing aspect and on the transactional aspect of it. But again, coming back to the different proposals, I think there is space to expand on that. And even if it didn't make it into this this proposal, which was very focused on the specific enabling structures and mechanisms, this could be something that, for example, comes up in later initiatives, or could be channeled in somehow also in the form of the issues that we try to tackle under the Data Act. So any sort of feedback would be very much appreciated, also as part of the consultation, so that we could take this into account. But to concretely answer the question, I'm not aware of any very specific or concrete initiative in the making in this field, in this realm.
Okay, thank you for that. I don't currently have any more questions in the chat, but we've got a reasonably sized audience, so perhaps we give them a moment just to see if anyone else wants to take the opportunity to question you. I'm not seeing any activity. Okay, well, in that case, it simply falls to me to thank you once again for a marvelous presentation. And Zoom meetings are horrible. We can't give you the second round of applause that you have richly deserved, but believe me, if we were here in person, we would. There's some clapping coming up on the screen. There we are. Thank you, people.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for everyone, really. I know it might have been a little long-winded, but I really wanted to just put it into a context. And if you have any questions, also in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out. Right now, we are very busy with the negotiations, but we try to accommodate, also meeting requests or just replying in writing to your questions as soon as and as much as possible. So again, this is an open invitation to engage either on this proposal or on the other data-related initiatives as well. So thank you again.
I've already had one request coming by email for a copy of the video of this from someone who couldn't attend, so there may be more of that, and we'll direct them to follow up with you if they need to. So thank you very much, and with that, I think we can call the meeting to a close. Thank you again, Andrea.